The Quiet Valley. Chapter 1. Before the Footprints. The morning fog rolled through Ashveil Hollow the way it always did, lazy and silver, catching in the branches of the black pines, pooling in the low places where the mushroom rings grew fat and luminous. The Aldermist River ran cold and clear through the centre of the valley, and the creatures who lived along its banks rose with the sun, the same as they always had. Maren was the first to smell something wrong. She lifted her enormous head from the shallows, water streaming from the mossy ridges of her neck, her 6 amber eyes blinking slowly in the pale light. She was what the old ones called a grevel, part river, part stone, part something older than either, and she had lived in Ashveil Hollow for 412 years. She knew the smell of every season, every rot, every bloom. This smell was none of those things. It was sharp, chemical. Beneath it, something coppery and deliberate. She said nothing yet. She turned back to the reeds where young Pip was still sleeping, curled into a luminous ball, his foxfire cooling to embers as the morning warmed him. He was barely 80 years old, just a kit, really, a Fenwick with too many teeth and not enough sense. She didn't want to frighten him before she was sure. But the smell came again on the next wind, and this time it carried something underneath it that made the ancient stones in her belly go cold. Metal, old blood, intent. By mid-morning everyone in Ashveil knew about the Gorthins. The Gorthin family lived in the eastern warrens, a tunnel system bored into the red clay hillside over generations, reinforced with woven roots and river stones. There were 11 of them, or had been. Gorthins were small, perhaps 4 feet tall, covered in overlapping scales the colour of wet bark, and they communicated largely through a complex language of clicks and low-frequency rumbles that travelled through the earth itself. Now 3 of them were dead. Maren arrived at the warrens to find a crowd already gathered. Old Hexis was there, the 3-eyed stag who served as something like a magistrate for the hollow, his silver antlers bent low with what might have been grief or might have been fury. It was difficult to tell with Hexis. He kept his feelings stored in deep places. Beside him stood the Moth Sisters, identical twins wrapped in wings the colour of autumn leaves, their compound eyes scanning the tree line with methodical precision. The 8 surviving Gorthins clustered at the mouth of their warren, clicking rapidly among themselves, their scales flared outward in distress. "Show me," Maren said. Hexis turned to her. His middle eye, the clouded one, watched her with particular intensity. "You will want to hold your composure," he said. "I am 400 years old," she said. "Show me." What she saw in the clearing outside the eastern warren stayed with her longer than she expected. Not the blood. Blood was not unfamiliar in any valley where things lived and died, not even the wounds, though they were deliberate and precise in a way that spoke of practised hands. It was the arrangement. The 3 Gorthins had been placed, posed, their small-scaled bodies positioned with a terrible care that suggested the killer had taken time, had lingered, had not been afraid. This was not a predator, Hexis said quietly, stepping beside her. "No," Maren agreed. "A predator takes what it needs and leaves." His voice was like dried leaves. This left a message. "What does it say?" The old stag was quiet for a long moment, his great head swinging slowly as he surveyed the scene. "It says, 'I was here. I am not afraid of you. I will come again.'" Chapter 2. The Shape of It. They called a council that evening at the Convergent Stone, a flat granite boulder the size of a house that sat at the hollow's centre, worn smooth by 1,000 years of gatherings. Creatures came from every corner of Ashveil. Maren arrived to find perhaps 40 of them already assembled, more arriving in the dusk. The hollowback bears, enormous and shaggy, their humped backs flickering with the bioluminescent patches they used for communication. Currently all of them pulsing a deep, anxious amber. The tanglebirds roosting in the canopy overhead, their long, mirrored tails reflecting the fireflies. The 3 river serpents, massive and old, their coils draped over roots at the water's edge. Even Grandmother Vetch had come, the ancient fungal entity who rarely stirred from her place beneath the northern hill, her network of mycelium cords still trailing behind her like a bridal train, connecting her to something distant and deep. "We know what it is?" asked Brist, the largest of the hollowback bears, her amber patches flaring insistently. "We know the kind of thing," Hexis said from the top of the convergent stone, where he stood with the authority of long age. "We do not yet know the specific creature." "What kind?" someone called from the back. Maren recognized the voice. Sallow, one of the moth sisters, perched high in the pines. Hexis paused. In the firefly-lit dark, he looked very old and very tired. "Human," he said. The word fell into the gathering like a stone into still water. Silence spread outward from it in rings. The creatures of Ashveil knew humans existed. They existed the way distant storms existed, a fact of the wider world, but one that had not, for a very long time, intersected with their valley. The hollow sat in a fold of terrain that humans had never found particularly interesting. There were no roads through it, no resources they valued. The old protective wards the moth sisters maintained at the valley's borders, subtle things, a confusion of the senses, a feeling of unease, of wrongness, had served well for generations. "The wards," Maren said. Sallow dropped from her pine branch and landed silently on the ground, her wings folding. Her face was heart-shaped and pale, her eyes enormous dark mirrors. "Intact," she said. "My sister and I checked them this morning, and again this afternoon. The perimeter is unbroken." "Then it came through them," said the other moth sister, Wren, descending from a different tree, completing her twin's thought as they always did. "Or it came from within," Brist rumbled. Another silence, differently shaped. "We would know if a human had lived in this valley," Hexis said. "We have always known." "We knew nothing about this one," Brist replied, and she said it without accusation, which somehow made it worse. Maren found the second camp before anyone else did. She was following the smell, her greatest gift, refined over centuries, catalogued and cross-referenced in the deep archive of her ancient mind. She had been tracking the chemical sharpness since morning, letting her legs carry her while her nostrils worked, and by late evening she had traced it to a narrow ravine on the valley's western edge that everyone tended to avoid, because the footing was treacherous and the shadows collected strangely there. The camp was modest, deliberate, a small shelter constructed against the rock face, camouflaged with branches in a way that suggested someone who had studied how the valley looked and thought carefully about how to disappear into it. A fire pit, cold, the ash recently scattered. Rope. Tools she didn't have names for, but recognized by instinct as designed for harm. And maps, pinned to the rock face with crude spikes, hand-drawn maps of Ashveil Hollow. Detailed ones, with paths marked, nesting sites circled, and along the margins, small careful notes in a script she couldn't read. She stood and looked at the maps for a long time. What she felt, looking at them, was something she rarely felt and had no particular fondness for: fear, not fear of pain. She had been struck by lightning twice, and both times had simply waited for it to stop. Not fear of death. She was old enough that death had lost its drama and become merely an appointment. What she felt, looking at those mapped circles, those margin notes, those careful measurements of her home and the people who lived in it, was something more specific: fear for others. She thought of young Pip, still sleeping in the reeds when she had left that morning. She thought of the Gorthin kit, barely hatched, whom she had seen just last week tumbling in the shallows while its parents clicked and rumbled in fond exasperation. She memorized everything in the camp, then walked back to the convergent stone, moving quickly. Chapter 3. What Pip Found. While Maren was in the ravine, Pip was doing what young Fenwicks did when told to stay in the reeds and not wander. Wandering. He was small and clever and faster than almost anything in the valley when he decided to be. His foxfire was under better control than it had been a decade ago, and he could keep it banked to near nothing when he concentrated, which meant he could move through the dark like a dimly glowing coal, not invisible but close enough, and the trees and shadows did the rest. He had heard the word human at the convergent stone, and had gone very quiet and very thoughtful in the particular way that worried Maren when she noticed it, because it meant he had already made a decision and was only now building the reasoning to support it. He found the human by following the noise it made. This surprised him. He had expected something that moved like a predator, low and careful, and near silent. What he found instead was something that moved like it owned the ground it walked on. Heavy, upright footsteps, the clink of metal tools against each other, wrapped poorly in cloth to muffle them, but not muffled enough. Occasional sounds from its throat that he eventually understood were not language, but something it did to itself in the silence, a private noise, almost a song, that made the fur along his spine rise straight up. It was not a large human. He was surprised by this too. The stories Grandmother Vetch told in her slow, patient way, threading memory through her mycelium and into the minds of those who listened, had given him an impression of great size. But this one was of average human dimensions, wrapped in practical clothing, carrying a large pack that moved with the careful silence of things inside it that were not allowed to rattle. It was moving toward the northern sleeping grounds, where the hollowback bears kept their young. Pip made a decision, fully formed, instantaneous, and catastrophic in its simplicity. He lit up. His foxfire erupted, white gold and sudden, flooding the forest with sharp light. He screamed with every voice in his register, which was considerable. Fenwick's had 6 vocal cords and could produce a range of sound that at full volume had been known to cause avalanches. The human stopped, turned. Pip saw its face for the first time and had a complicated moment where what he had expected, rage, hunger, the blankness he associated with predators, met what he actually saw, which was something he couldn't name but filed away carefully. Not fear, not excitement, but a focused, quiet readiness, like something settling into place. Then it reached for something in its pack, and Pip ran. He ran the way only a Fenwick could run, which was low to the ground and faster than reason, and in the kind of irregular zigzag pattern that made him nearly impossible to track. He ran screaming, which served 2 purposes. It warned anyone ahead of him, and it kept his own panic from compressing his throat. Behind him he heard footsteps for a few seconds, fast, horribly capable footsteps, and then nothing. Nothing was worse. He burst into the northern sleeping grounds and found Brist already awake, her amber patches blazing sunrise orange, 2 of her yearlings pressed against her flanks. "North trail," he gasped. "Coming north. Armed." Brist didn't wait for more. She reared up on her hind legs, all 8 feet of her, luminous and enormous in the dark, and let out a sound that wasn't a roar, but something below it, a vibration that went through the ground itself. Around the northern grounds, other hollowbacks rose from their dens. Pip turned and looked back the way he'd come. The trees were empty and still. Chapter 4. The Council at Dawn. "It's hunting us," Brist said. There was no longer any gentleness in her voice. The amber in her patches had gone hard and deep, the color of old wounds. "It mapped us. It is methodical. It will not be frightened away." "The wards," Sallow began. "Clearly the wards are no longer sufficient." Hexis raised his head from where he had been listening with his eyes half closed. Dawn was beginning to grey the sky above the pines, and in its flat light he looked ancient and carved. "We do not know what it wants," he said. "We do not know if it is alone." 3 Gorthins dead," Brist said. "How much more do we need to know?" "We know that it kills," Hexis said. "We do not know why, and the why matters. A hungry predator will not behave as a territorial one. A territorial one will not behave as one that kills for pleasure." He paused. "And one that kills for pleasure will not behave as one that kills for a purpose we have not yet identified." Maren, who had been watching the tree line since her return from the ravine, turned back to the group. "The maps," she said. "The margin notes. Someone among us needs to read them." A murmur. Several glances exchanged. "Grandmother Vetch," Wren said. Grandmother Vetch did not travel well, but she travelled. She sent her mycelium ahead of her in long, searching threads, testing the ground, reading the accumulated memory of everything that had ever died in Ashveil Hollow, and she moved behind it like the slow pulling of a tide. By mid-morning she stood at the entrance to the ravine. her vast soft body filling the space gently, her sensory fronds extended. Maren watched her read the maps. It was not a quick process. Vetch didn't have eyes in the conventional sense, but her surface was covered in chemical receptors of extraordinary sensitivity, and she pressed portions of herself against the inked paper with careful patience, tasting the pigment, the pressure of the marks, the residue of the hand that had made them. The gathering waited. When Vetch finally spoke, she spoke slowly as she always did, and in the layered voice that meant she was pulling from deep memory as well as present understanding. "I know this hand," she said. Silence. "Not this individual, but I know its tradition." Her fronds moved in a slow pulse, something like agitation. "There are humans who have hunted things like us across time, not for food, not for territory, for—" She paused, searching for the right container for what she wanted to say. For the fact of it, for the record of it. There are humans who have dedicated themselves to the pursuit and ending of things that are not human, out of a conviction that the world is tidier without us in it. "They believe we are monsters," Hexis said. "Yes, but not—" Another long pause. "Not in fear. Fear I could understand. This is something colder than fear. It is a project, an accounting. This one—" Her fronds touched the margin notes again. "This one has been doing this for a long time. These are not the notes of a first journey." Maren looked at the maps, at the circles, at the careful, patient handwriting running along every edge. "How long?" she asked. "The notes reference places," Vetch said. "Valleys, hollows, wetlands. The names are human names. I don't know them all. But I know Ashveil by another name, one humans used long ago when some of them passed through this country." She was quiet. "There are 14 sites referenced before ours." 14. The word moved through the gathering like weather. Chapter 5. Brist's Plan. "We end it," Brist said. She was not speaking rhetorically. Her patches had gone the flat white that meant she was beyond anger and into something steadier and more deliberate. "We have numbers. We have speed. We have every advantage except—" "Except what?" Pip asked. He was technically not supposed to be at this meeting, but no one had told him to leave with sufficient conviction, and he had remained. "Except that we don't know where it is." A pause. Everyone turned to look at Maren. She held up a hand, or what served as one, her broad stone-textured appendage raised in a gesture for patience. "If we hunt it directly, we risk losing someone else. It is prepared for direct confrontation. The camp, the tools, it has done this before. It has a method for when things find it." "What do you suggest?" Hexis asked. Maren was quiet for a moment. The idea had been forming since the ravine, since she had stood looking at the circles on the map, and felt that particular cold fear. It was not an idea she loved. It required something that didn't come naturally to most of the Hollow's inhabitants, who were, despite the assumptions of the outside world, not especially inclined toward violence or strategy. They were, most of them, creatures of routine and season, and the long comfortable logic of a place that had been safe for generations. "I suggest we let it find us," she said, "but we choose where." The Saltmarsh was the ugliest part of Ashveil, a broad, shallow bog at the valley's southern edge, where the ground could not decide between land and water, and had settled unhappily on both. Nothing much lived there. The conditions were too unpredictable, and it smelled of sulphur when the seasons changed, but it was on the maps, circled. "It will come here," Maren said, standing at the marsh's edge. "Either it has already planned to, or we make it come here." She laid out what she had in mind with an economy of words, watching their faces as she did, the moth sisters growing very still in that way that meant they were thinking hard. Hexis's expression difficult to read, as always, Brist's patches cycling through several colours in quick succession. It was not a complex plan. Complexity was dangerous when some of your participants communicated primarily through ground vibrations and others had no language at all in the conventional sense. It was a plan of timing and placement, and the careful use of what each of them could do. "You're sure it will come at night?" Pip asked. "It has come at night for all of this," Maren said. "That is its preference. Darkness. It trusts its tools more than its eyes, I think, but our eyes are better in the dark." "What about me?" Pip asked. "You stay at the northern grounds with the Gurtin family and the yearlings." His face, a complicated arrangement of fur and too many teeth, arranged itself into an expression of profound indignation. "I found it," he said. "I warned everyone. If I hadn't—" "Yes," Maren said, "and the northern grounds will be unguarded tonight, and you are the fastest creature in this valley and possibly the loudest. If it does not come to the marsh, if my reading is wrong, you are our warning system." She paused, then added more quietly, "You are not small to me, Pip. You are important to me. Stay with the families." He was quiet for a moment. Then his foxfire pulsed once, warm, and he said nothing more. Chapter 6. The Saltmarsh night came in stages, the way it did in summer, a long lavender twilight that deepened slowly, the stars emerging one by one, the fireflies beginning their low, drifting patrol above the reeds. They took their places. The moth sisters climbed the dead trees at the marsh's northern edge, their wings folded to match the bark, their compound eyes turned outward to catch every photon the darkness offered. Brist and 2 other hollowbacks waded into the shallows on the far side, submerging their luminous patches, becoming large wet shadows among the reeds. The river serpents moved beneath the water in their slow, gliding way, their positions known only by the subtle displacement of the surface. Maren stood at the center of the marsh and waited. She was not especially good at waiting. This surprised people who assumed that creatures of great age were naturally patient. She had found that patience and age had no correlation. She had simply had more time to practice doing the things she found difficult. She stood and breathed, and let the marsh settle back into its ordinary rhythms around her. 2 hours passed. 3. Then she heard it. Not footsteps. The human was better than that. What she heard was a change in the marsh's breathing, the frogs going silent in a spreading wave from the eastern edge inward, the way they did when something large was moving through. A disruption propagating through the living net of the place, invisible and unmistakable. She stayed still. Above her she could feel the moth sisters track the movement. She trusted their eyes. They could count the legs on a spider at 100 feet in starlight. She felt, more than heard, Brist's patches suppressed to nothing, the faint warm glow of the hollowbacks extinguishing. The eastern reeds shifted. The human came into the marsh at the edge, moving with genuine skill and caution, pausing every few steps, reading the dark with equipment that Maren had seen in the camp and guessed at the function of, tools that let it see heat, she believed, based on the way it was sweeping them back and forth in a slow arc. She was cold-blooded, mostly stone. She read as the marsh did. The human moved further in. The marsh was deceptive in ways that only revealed themselves under pressure. The ground that looked solid was not. The channels between the hummocks were deeper than they appeared. Maren had known this marsh for 4 centuries. She had walked every inch of it in every season, and the map in her mind of its currents and catches and sudden depths was as detailed and certain as a thing could be. She had not chosen this place by accident. She waited until the human was 8 steps past the point of easy retreat. Then she rose. She had not moved. She simply became visible, which for a creature mostly composed of riverstone and living moss was a transformation of attention rather than position. She went from being part of the landscape to being the specific and undeniable thing she was. 400 years old, broad as a fallen tree, her 6 amber eyes opening in the dark, the human froze. In its hesitation, 1 second too, the river serpents moved, not to attack, to occupy the channels behind it, their bodies blocking the roots out with passive, implacable mass. The moth sisters dropped from the dead trees, not to the ground but to the air, their wingspan enormous in the open space above the marsh, wheeling in slow circles that cut off the sky. Brist rose from the water. The human was surrounded by things that, in terms of raw capability, could have ended it in the first moment. But nothing moved to strike, nothing lunged. They simply were. For a long moment, the marsh held its breath. Maren looked at the human. The human looked at Maren. She had time now, in stillness, to see what she had not seen from a distance or in the dark of the ravine. The human was not young, but not old, somewhere in the long middle stretch of its short life. There was something in its face that she had seen before, but only in the faces of the very elderly among her own kind, a settled certainty, long held, not rage, not fear, something that had been compressed over years into a hard, quiet shape. It was afraid. Of course it was afraid. It was surrounded by ancient things in the dark of a marsh it had misjudged. But the fear was not the largest thing in its face. The largest thing was a terrible, patient conviction. Maren thought of the 14 sites in the margin notes. 14 places circled on maps. 14 clearings, probably, arranged with deliberate care. "You've been doing this for a long time," she said. The human stared at her, swallowed. "I don't expect it to speak to me," she continued. "I don't need it to. I only wanted—" She stopped, resettled herself. "I wanted to see it. I wanted it to see me." The human had not reached for its tools. This surprised her, and she examined the surprise. Perhaps it recognized, on some functional level, that the tools were no longer the relevant element. Or perhaps, she considered this, it had simply never been seen before, not truly, not as what it was, not a hero excising a wound from the world, not an instrument of correction, but a creature that came in the night to end smaller creatures who had never done anything at all to it. 3 Gorthins, she said, 80 years old, the oldest. They tended the riverside roots. They had a kit. She let the words sit. The kit's name translates approximately to first warmth after a long winter. It doesn't have a mother anymore. The human's face moved. She watched it carefully, the way she watched everything, reading the minute shifts in its expression the way she read the marsh's changes. It did not look triumphant. It looked, she thought, and this surprised her more than anything else had, uncertain, as if it had been told a story about what these creatures were for so long, and with such conviction that meeting them as they actually were was a species of disorientation it was not prepared for. "There are children everywhere in this valley," Maren said quietly. "There are families, old and young. There are creatures who love each other. There are dead that are mourned. There is a young Fenwick who screamed so loudly last night to warn his neighbours that he damaged his own throat and won't recover his full voice for a month, and he did it without hesitation because he was afraid for others." She paused. "What story were you told about us? That we had none of this?" The human did not answer, but its hand, which had been drifting toward its pack, went still. Chapter 7. After They Did Not Kill It. This was the part of the story that Pip, when he eventually told it in the way that Fenwicks tells stories, with fire and gesture, and the full deployment of his remaining 6/10 of a voice, always told with a satisfaction that confused his listeners. "But you had it," they would say, the young ones especially, their eyes wide. "You had it surrounded." "Yes," he would say. "So why—" "Because that's not what we are," he would say, and his foxfire would pulse in the colour he used for emphasis. That was the entire point. That was what Maren wanted it to understand. What they did, they walked it out. Maren in front, Brist behind, the moth sisters above, the river serpents tracking its path through the water table. They walked it north through the marsh, and through the pines, and to the valley's edge, where the wardstones marked the hollow's boundary. They did not touch it. They did not rush it. They walked it out the way you walk a storm out, with patience, with intention, with the clear message that the path forward is the only path available. At the boundary, Maren stopped. The human stood at the edge of Ashveil Hollow, and looked back at the assembled shapes that had followed it there. She watched it look at Brist, enormous and luminous, at the moth sisters perched in the last pines, their mirrored tails catching starlight, at the 3 river serpents, who had surfaced in the final stream to watch with their ancient, expressionless eyes. She could not know what it thought. She was not built for that kind of knowing, but it left. It walked out of the hollow, and into the wider dark beyond the ward stones, and the ward stones sealed behind it, and the moth sisters set to work on the wards with a focus and attention they had never brought to that work before, reinforcing every layer, tuning the unsettled feeling they projected to something deeper and more specifically repellent. Ashveil Hollow was quiet. They buried the 3 Gorthins in the riverside clay, the way Gorthins preferred, their bodies arranged in the sleeping position, surrounded by the river stones that their kin brought and placed with clicking, patient care. The 8 surviving Gorthins performed their mourning rites for 3 days, the ground vibrating with the sound of it, a deep and constant resonance that the entire hollow could feel. Maren attended all 3 days. Pip brought the kit, whose name really did translate to something like first warmth after a long winter, to sit with her on the 2nd day. The kit was small and frightened, and kept its scales flared out in distress, but it pressed itself against Maren's side eventually, seeking the warmth that her large body held, like a stored heat from the sun, and she stayed very still and let it sleep there. "Will it come back?" Pip asked on the 3rd day, sitting beside her while the Gorthin morning song rumbled through the earth beneath them. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but others might." "Others might." He was quiet. His foxfire moved in slow, thoughtful waves. "The maps were the part that scared me," he said eventually. "Not the weapons, the maps, that it had sat somewhere and thought about us, and written it down." "Yes," Maren said. "Because you can take away someone's weapons," he said, "but you can't make them unknow something." She looked at him, this young and too clever creature with his too many teeth and his still damaged voice, and his tendency towards decisions she hadn't sanctioned. He was 80 years old. He had centuries ahead of him, if the world allowed it. "No," she said, "you can't. So what do we do?" The morning song moved through the valley, through the clay and roots and riverstone, through the old accumulated grief of generations. Around them, Ashveil Hollow lived its ordinary life. A tanglebird called from somewhere in the black pines, its mirrored tail flashing. A hollowback yearling splashed in the shallows, its patches blinking in careless gold. Grandmother Vetch moved in her slow peripheral way through the northern woods, threading her network deeper, reading the old and patient memory of the earth. "We know it now," Maren said. "We know what it looks like. We know how it moves. We know the maps it makes, and the notes it writes in the margins." She rested one broad hand on the ground, on the clay and root and riverstone, on the accumulated centuries of her home. "We watch, we warn, we remember." She felt the Gorthin morning song through her palm. "And when it forgets that we are watching," she said, "we remind it." Pip was quiet for a moment. Then his foxfire went warm and steady, the color it was when he had decided something without the drama of deciding. "Okay," he said. The sun moved in its arc above Ashveil Hollow. The river ran cold and clear. The fog rolled in from the low places, lazy and silver, and the creatures who lived there rose to meet the morning the way they always had. They were watching now. They would not stop.